HDR, the wonder of the 21st century. When it comes to photography, you want your images to be overcolored, super sharp, extra grungy, and that's what every photo needs to look like, right? Nope. So that intro was basically because HDR has gotten a really bad name over the last few years, mainly because when it first got to where it was catching on, people were really making their pictures super bold, super exaggerated, me included. If you go back and look at my portfolio, I've left a few of them in there that were just a little over the top. And it was a cool look for a while, but it's kind of like, you know, different kinds of music. They come in and then they go. And so it was one of those trends where it's starting to evolve now, and people are starting to realize there's a lot more to HDR than just bringing out over-exaggerated details in your photos. It's about trying to achieve what the human eye is capable of seeing and your camera sensor is not able to pick up. So the way I like to use HDR is exactly that. So let's go into Photoshop here real quick, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth about it and show you the process I go through with a lot of my HDR photography nowadays. So what is HDR exactly? Well, it stands for High Dynamic Range, and with DSLR photography, you are limited to how much light or shadow comes into a shot at the same time. So like if you're wanting to expose something that is really dark, it's going to blow the background out, and vice versa. If you're wanting to expose something like this couch but get the exposure right, it's going to make everything else around it darker. And so with HDR, it gives you the option of capturing all of this information at once. And when I say at once, I mean once it's in Photoshop. You're not actually capturing it all at once in the camera. So you have to take bracketed shots, and you can do this automatically on a lot of cameras, or you can do this manually. I choose to do it manually because most cameras max out at like 5 or 6 brackets, I think. Mine, I think, brackets only 3 different exposures. And when I say bracketing, that means setting it to where you can basically hit the shutter either timed, or you can use a release button, something to keep the image stable on your tripod. But when you hit that button, it's going to take 3 to 5 different shots, and they're going to be at different exposures that you've determined ahead of time. So with this process that I do, I use a really stable tripod, and I change the exposure manually, and that way I can take up to 20 different exposures if I really want to condense every little bit of information I can into an image. And rarely do you need that many exposures, but there have been a few exceptions where I've used up to like 18 of them, and it's actually worked out amazing in some of my photos. So in HDR, like for example, we've got a dark exposure here, and they kind of go up, and you can see we're getting brighter and brighter and brighter. So on this bright one here, it exposes the detail of like the brick and the shadows. You can kind of see what's underneath here. I didn't go for an even brighter one because what's under there is really not that important. The focus is kind of the couch and just the surroundings here. So this is as bright as I'm going to go. Plus, the more of these images that we combine together in HDR, the longer the processing time takes. So for the sake of the tutorial, I've actually chosen more than enough here. I mean, you can get by with 2 to 3 different exposures and get a pretty decent photo. But I wanted to really show you an in-depth one. So if we go down here to the darkest one, you can see that we can see all the little details in this couch, and still the whites aren't blown out. And so that's the purpose of having such a dark exposure, is getting these little things right here where we get the details in the window and whatnot. And so I'm doing this in Lightroom, but you can also do this from Adobe Bridge. But I prefer to organize my photos in Lightroom, and I know a lot of other people do. It's probably the more popular version of how to do this at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and select all these photos and show you how we get them into Photoshop. So you select everything, and then you hold down Control and click, but you want to get to the Edit In menu, and we're going to go down here, and you're going to see Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. And this is not the only way you can do this. You can also have it set up to export into like Photomatics, or there's several other HDR softwares out there, but I really feel like Photoshop handles this the best. So let's go ahead and click that, and this is going to take a little bit of time. It's going to process this. You won't see anything for a second because Lightroom is thinking, but pretty soon it's going to switch over to the Photoshop side of things. and you're going to see the little spinning wheel, and it's going to start bringing these images in. And it'll do it one at a time, and you won't be able to really do anything in Photoshop while this is happening, because Photoshop is calculating where all these images need to go, and it's also analyzing the lights and darks as it pulls each one of these images in. And then the next step it'll go through, I believe, will be the alignment process, where it looks at specific points like the edges of the window and whatnot, and it'll make sure that this photo is perfectly lined up. That way, if you didn't use a tripod and you just took like a 3-shot bracket and you handheld your camera, you can still get it to line up perfectly or very close to perfectly, even, you know, if the shots were a little shaky. So that's not the ideal way to shoot HDR, but it does work. And in a pinch, you see something, you're walking down the street and you go, man, I love this. This is a perfect shot, but I want to make sure to get it in HDR. You can get away with doing it handheld. So Photoshop has processed all those and brought everything in, and it's basically showing me these images down here. For this particular shot, this is not going to really apply, but if you was to have, say, in one of these exposures, a person walking by and you wanted to get rid of them, you could click that photo and uncheck it, and that person would disappear. You can also use the remove ghosting technique if there's like leaves blowing, or, you know, if there's one person in a frame. Remove ghosting will automatically determine what image has an element in it that wasn't in the other images, and it will help you not have like this faint object that was from one of the exposures. Like if there was a person walking here, they'd look almost like a ghost, which is where they get the term, because it would combine them with all the other images, and so they'd be transparent somewhat. You know, you'd only see them kind of with the bricks coming through their body. But we're not even going to worry about remove ghosting here, because I really just don't see anything that would be moving in this shot. And if I remember right, it was a really still day. So at this point, I don't change these settings. I leave it in 32-bit mode and complete toning in Adobe Camera Raw, because I want as much control over this as possible. You can go in here and choose 16-bit mode, and you've got all these different ways of processing your image right here, but I prefer to do it in Camera Raw. So I'm going to hit Tone in ACR, which is Adobe Camera Raw, and it's going to compress all of these images, all 7 of them that were there, and I know you only see 4 here. If I was to scroll over with the scroll bar, they would all be there, all 7 images. So it's going to compress these into one single giant file that contains the information of all of these images. And you're going to see it pop up here in Camera Raw. Okay, so here is our image in Camera Raw, and I'm going to go ahead and shrink this window up a little bit just to make sure everybody can see this, because I'm actually using a MacBook Retina display, but I'm wanting to put this video out in 1080p, and so this way you can make sure to see everything I'm seeing. You've got all your sliders here like you normally do in Camera Raw, except there's actually more information here than meets the eye. So this image, if I was to say dial my highlights down, see how that couch, the detail comes out in that couch? Now watch the shadows. I could bring the shadows way up and get a lot of detail, and you can do this in other images too, but you start getting a lot of grain and a lot of noise the more that you crank these shadows up, because it's actually trying to process information that isn't there, or it's there and it's really fuzzy, or, you know, it just got a lot of noise in it. And this way you've got a cleaner image. Like if I was to zoom up to this at 100% and kind of move around the screen, even down here in the shadows where you can see like brick back there and whatnot, it's not grainy. You don't see tons of little pixels and things like that. So even if I brought the exposure up, I can start bringing out what's underneath that and still retain tons of detail. So that's where the power of this HDR is. And I know a lot of people like to use HDR to like make these really blown out, over-processed images, and if that's your style, that's cool. I'm not knocking it. I'm saying I don't use HDR that way. I used to when I first started doing it, because you were like, wow, look at that detail. Like I'd crank the clarity up and make everything super grungy. And that's cool, and it does have its purpose occasionally, but for me, HDR is about getting all of my detail natural, the way my eye saw it when I was there, because you know when you take that photo and you go, oh, this shot is beautiful, and then you get it into your computer and you go, oh, that doesn't look anything like how I saw it. Well, this is a way of letting you get that image to look more like how your eye picked it up, because your eye picks up a larger frequency of light, you know, a bigger spectrum, so you're able to get those shadows and highlights with your eyes. And so let's get this image to where it just looks pleasing to the eye. So the first thing I would do is I would work on my highlights. I would want that couch to not look like it was reflecting too much light. Like here it's blown out, in my opinion. You can always use your histogram if you want to know if it's truly blown out. And what you can do is when you crank up your highlights, it's technically not blown out. I'm still not getting any highlights that are blowing out until I go up to here and you see it turn red. But my eye sees it as, where's the detail? So I don't always rely on my histogram for my highlights. I do, however, use it a little more for my darks. As you can see, this is saying this is pitch black. You can't get any darker. That's why it's blue. I'm not going to worry about it right now, but I will toggle that on. But for the couch purpose, I would dial my highlights way back in this particular photo because that couch is going to be probably the center of attention. And then I might bring my exposure up and see where things are at. Play with the shadows a little bit, see if I want any of that lower stuff to come in. And honestly, I don't want a lot of it, but I don't want it to be overly contrasty. And that's another thing you can do is you can actually bring your contrast level down at first while you're working with this. And that way, when you're messing with shadows or highlights and stuff, you're not getting too harsh of an image. Because you can always dial in some blacks later on if you want to just make the picture pop a little bit more, because your blacks and whites also work basically like contrast. But it's just emphasizing the really bright, crisp areas and the really dark, shadowy, low-key part of the picture. So if I was to bring some whites into this picture, you would see the contrast changing. And then I would, you know, since my highlights are already down, I don't have any wiggle room. And so that's why I like to bring the highlights down first and then decide where I want my whites. And usually my blacks, you know, I kind of don't play with them a whole lot at first. I'll just bring up the exposure, and then we might play with the contrast a little bit more. And you can see here, there's still some detail missing in the highlights. So if I wanted to, I could bring it really depends on what you're trying to focus on. Like this is a pretty well-rounded look here. It might be a little dark, but it lets me get all these details in my photo. And then since I brought that down, I could bring my highlights up just a little bit. I just don't want that couch to feel like it has a sheen on it, but that feels fairly comfortable to the eye. Maybe just a little more down. Now, if you feel like you're getting too much color in certain areas, like this right down here, you have several ways of adjusting that in Camera Raw. First off, I would just start with messing with the saturation. And if you feel like you're losing color across the board too much, which in this case we are, you can see that we're losing all this color in the brick, then what you can also do is bring up a little bit more color, but then selectively go into your hue and saturation and like grayscale panel. We're not doing grayscale, but you have the option of converting this into a black and white, and then you can control like your reds and bring them up or down and darken things. We're going to go ahead and do this in color because I'm going to process this in black and white later on. So what I'm seeing right down in here are some orange levels that maybe I want to either change the color of by being in hue. I can make that more reddish, or I could dial it back and it would get more yellow. I would say it's more about saturation to me. I might want to bring that down just a little bit. And then to compensate is bring some of the reds back up so that that brick comes back out. But it kind of levels out the colors between here and here, and there's not such a glaring difference. Now, as you can see down here, we've got some yellow trash and stuff like that. And if you want that to be less obvious, you can always desaturate that yellow a little bit, and it'll kind of tame it down in the photo, and it'll blend in with the rest of the unattractive trash. Now, by cranking these reds, you can see here in the image, if I go up 100%, there is something down here, probably another piece of trash. There's some red that gets brought out more right there. That's okay. It's just such a small spot that I'll deal with that later on if I don't want it in the picture. So let's just go ahead and zoom back and look at the overall picture. Sorry, we need fit in view. We'll look at the overall picture. And I tend to keep things a little on the flat side because we're going to build contrast as we go. So let's look and see if there's any other colors we want to enhance or bring out, like lightness wise. Like since this couch is so white, maybe we want to go into our luminance and darken the scene around us a little bit here by cranking down the oranges and the reds so that this couch sticks out more. We can even bring the yellow down a little bit, and that makes that couch stand out even more. It gives it kind of more of an evening type of feel. We've got a purple here that might get affected if we bring in the purple light just a little bit down, or not bring it in, but bring it down. So you can see that that's affecting the window just a little bit. So we can kind of tame that down too and bring even more focus to what we're wanting to work with in the final image. Okay, let's see if our magentas bring us any help. A little bit on the door over here. I'm going to go ahead and bring them all the way down just to darken as many things around this couch as I can, because this way you're not using like a vignette to bring focus to the picture. You're actually using your colors to draw the eye right here. Not really any greens, I don't think, happening here. So when you move that slider, you're not going to see a lot of difference with these colors. The blues, however, you do. If you look up here in the windows, like the aquas and blues, you're getting a little more reflection. So if you're wanting to see how much more distracting that is with the couch, with the brighter color above it, then if I bring it down, your eye goes back to the couch. So we'll probably crank that down, and let's play even with the blue. I don't think we want to go quite that dark. It is paint on the windows, so a little bit of darkness is nice to show that it's not just a reflection happening there. It's actually somebody who had painted up the windows. So now I'm going to go back to my regular settings and tweak this a little bit more. So now I've got the option of bringing up the exposure a little bit, bringing the highlights down a little bit more if I want to see a little more detail in this windowsill and in this couch. And then I can bring the overall brightness up a little bit if I want to. It's really about that couch. So when I feel like the couch looks good, the rest of the image is easy to treat later on. Now, if I wanted to, I could boost the clarity a little bit here to bring out some of the detail, but the higher you bring that, you see this photo starts getting that grungy look. So if I do use clarity, it's very sparing. Like I might, dial it up that much just to give a little bit of edge to this photo. But in this particular case, I'm not going to, because I'm going to handle those details later on in Photoshop. I'm really just concerned about getting the correct exposures that I want to work with here. They might not be totally correct to your eye right now, but I'm thinking ahead, kind of like playing chess. You have to think several moves ahead, and I'm thinking, what is going to cause me problems as I begin to process this image further in Photoshop? And so I'm trying to even this out in a way to where I know it's going to be really easy to work within a third-party plugin or using my adjustment layers later on. So I feel pretty good about this. I feel like everything is kind of evened out. It's kind of flat, but that's what I want. And so I'm going to hit OK, and this is going to process this image, and we'll see the difference. Okay, so if I want to see the difference between what I did and what I originally had, a real easy way to do that is to hit Control and click, and you're going to see New Smart Object via Copy. This is not the same as hitting Command J, because Command J will make a duplicate, but if you change something in one, it will change it in both. This gives this one, the second version of it, independent Camera Raw control from this one. And so I'm going to open up Camera Raw again real quick and just reset my values. And that's back to where it was when I first made an HDR of it. And so it's going to process that, and now we can just toggle this on and off. So here's our after, which I'll drag to the top. And here's our before. So you can look at this real quick and watch what details come out. Sure, it has a little more punch here, but look at all the detail that we brought out in the couch without even using the clarity filter in Camera Raw. This is just by adjusting our lights and darks and the different exposure values and color values. Okay, so this is our after image. And so I'm not even going to keep this other one as the comparison. I feel happy with what we've got. And now our image is ready to start editing, except for the one thing. If you go up here to mode, you're going to see it's 32 bits per channel. Now, a lot of the stuff that you do in Photoshop, at least at this point where we're at on this Photoshop build, most of your plugins and a lot of the adjustment layers and effects built within Photoshop will not work on a 32-bit. Well, it looks like they've actually updated quite a few of them, but you can see that some of them are grayed out. And so you have less options of processing the image in 32-bit mode as you would in 16-bit mode. And 16-bit is what most cameras are capturing at. At this point in time when this video was made, 16-bit is the standard of how a Camera Raw image comes out in your camera. So what we can do is we'll convert this to 16-bit, And you're going to get this little warning because we're basically converting from 32-bit to 16-bit, so we are doing a little bit of destructive editing to the image, and that's fine. I'm just going to say merge. And we're going to immediately see our photo change, and we're going to be like, oh, God, that's not what I chose at all. Well, all you have to do is go up here to exposure and gamma and just leave it at the settings that it shows here. And if you click between these two, it looks to the eye exactly or almost, and you might notice a slight difference, but most of the time you won't see any difference. So if you click that little setting, there's your same image, but it's in 16-bit mode this time, and it's ready to use all of your filters, including your third-party plugins like MacFun or Nick or any of these others that you might have installed. And so now you also have access, you know, to all of your adjustment layers, and you could go in here with your curves and make further dark and light adjustments if you wanted to. And then you have the option of making a layer mask and just adjusting the parts that you want. Like if I want to darken the overall feel of the image or give it a little more boost, I can do this right here. And then I could brush the couch out, or I could brush the couch in. So in this particular case, I would want to take like a black brush, and I'm on my brush tool here, and I might just want to protect that, keep those highlights and shadows from getting too contrasty. And so if I click on and off from this, you can see that I've darkened the scene around it, but the couch still remains pretty close to the same. And I also have the options now of controlling with my opacity and just dialing it in a little bit to where I want it. And you could also go in here and make a black and white at this point based off of the colors that you have just by clicking the black and white layers adjustment. And then you've got the adjustments here, like you can bring your yellows down. It just lets you kind of adjust your black and white image, sort of like we did in Camera Raw, but just get it, you know, a little more fine-tuned. Bring your focus where you want it. So this is what I would do if I was processing a black and white, and I wasn't using a third-party plugin to achieve my black and white. I would go in and use this, and then I would keep playing with my levels, my curves, and then you've always got the option of, you know, giving it kind of a sepia look here just by pulling your slider over, bringing your saturation down a little bit. And then just another quick tip here is you can also make a new layer, make a duplicate of everything that you see underneath it by hitting Command, Option, Shift, and E. And then a little quick trick I do is I'll go into Camera Raw. If I want to just give myself a little bit of a vignette, I'll go over here to the effects panel and I'll pull it real strong all the way to the left and kind of find where I want my image to focus. And I use a little feathering in there. And I kind of do a little dance between midpoint and roundness because you can get a little less of a rectangular look if you kind of go back and forth between the two and find the focus you want. Then I double click on that and it takes it completely off, and then I can just dial it in a little bit for mood if I want that vignette. And then I might even bring a gradient filter up here and pull my exposure. Let me click overlay off and bring that down a little bit, and also my contrast so that I don't lose all the detail, but I lose some of the brightness. And I can kind of bring the shadows up so that you still see the details down there, but the focus still goes to the couch a little bit more. So if I wanted to do that, then you've got the option of this being a separate layer and playing with your opacity here and bringing that in as strong as you want. So those are just some quick ways of playing with HDR. I took it a little further than the HDR part just to show you that you've got a lot more control in your post-processing. Like you can see, I've got lots of detail in this couch yet, and I've created some mood here. But most of that we did before we even got to these layers. That was just our Camera Raw look. And then I had the option of just real quickly bringing it to this point. And it would have been a lot harder to get this image with a single shot. This couch would have either been blown out or this background would have been extremely dark, and a lot of this detail would have been unrecoverable. So that's how I like to use HDR, and I hope that's helpful for you and your workflow. So that's one way that I use HDR processing in my photography. My name is Stephen McAnulla. This is The Art of Photography, and be sure to hit the subscribe button on my YouTube channel. That way when I put out a new video, you're going to get an update and you'll know, hey, it's time to learn something new.
And don't forget to look down below in the description, not in the video area, but scroll down, and in the description area, there'll be links for my Facebook, my Twitter page, 500px, my official website, and a whole lot of other stuff. There's also a affiliate code for Mac Fun software. So if you use the code that's provided, which is Stephen M, it will give you 10% off of one or all of their applications on their website. So be sure to use that code and get 10% off your entire order. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next tutorial.